Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my wide receiver rankings for Week 16. This channel's intended for half PPR. It's the second week of the playoffs. I hope you made it past the wild card round. But we're going to talk about the position. We're going to get into some scoring trends first and show you a chart. Look at this graph! This graph right here represents the last 4 games for every wide receiver, their average scoring in points per game. That's what the blue dots indicate, and they're arranged from most to fewest over the last 4 weeks. The red dots are their season average. So we can pick up on some trends, which players have stepped up lately and which players are fading, who is in a slump and is probably worth benching. So let's get into it. At number 1, he has fallen down a little bit closer to league average, but still at the top it is Ja'Marr Chase. Number 2 on a massive hot streak lately is Davante Adams, who's reclaiming his glory days with Aaron Rodgers. I think they're just playing for the record books right now. I think at the end of the season, they want the record for most touchdowns between a quarterback and receiver to be the Aaron Rodgers Davante Adams combo. It's hard to find a better one in terms of touchdowns. So I definitely trust Adams right now. If you started him last week, he paid off, and he is money in the bank. You cannot bench Adams at the moment. Number 3, another player you cannot bench would be Puka Nacua. Obvious option. 10 plus targets for each of the top 3. In the last month, all 3 players are getting at least 10 targets per game, and they're all going over 20 fantasy points per game. Number 4 is Jordan Addison, who's on a major hot streak in terms of deep shot touchdowns they have been hitting, and in terms of ceiling, it is massive. The floor is a little shaky sometimes, but it's hard to find a higher ceiling than with a guy like Addison. In best ball, Addison is perfect. And lately, he's been a league winner. But right behind Addison, we have Jeudy, who is probably going to fall off a cliff with Dorian Thompson-Robinson. I just don't see the same level of target volume and accuracy down the field as opposed to with Jameis Winston. I understand why they're benching Winston, but for fantasy, I would really prefer if Winston remained the quarterback for the Browns. So Jeudy, a bit of a liability this week with a new quarterback, but he's been so good. He's also getting a ton of volume. It's hard to feel like you can actually bench Jeudy. But that game against the Broncos, if you take that out, these numbers are nowhere near this high. Jeudy is not the same player with a different quarterback. But number 6, a lock in your lineup, a Hall of Fame caliber player, Mike Evans. As I watched him torch my Chargers last week, that hamstring injury, you would be shocked to find out it was just a few weeks ago. He looked fantastic. Mike Evans is a true stud. Mike Evans has to be in your lineup. And I also think Brian Thomas Jr. also has to be in your lineup. I've been in love with Brian Thomas Jr. ever since the draft. Even before that, when he ran a 4.33 at the Combine, it was overshadowed by Xavier Worthy. But this is a lightning fast player, true athlete, and it's really showing. With Mac Jones, Brian Thomas Jr. is averaging 17 points per game in the last month. A fantastic option, and boy, do I regret trading him in the subscriber league a few weeks ago. Damn, I wish I had Brian Thomas at the moment. But let's move on. Next player on the list would be Terry McLaurin, who I'm a bit worried about. While he's been insane, I don't think you can bench him. He does get the Eagles this week, and it's a very difficult matchup against Quinion Mitchell, Cooper DeJean. I would be kind of surprised if Terry finds the end zone. He has 5 touchdowns the last 4 games, and that is kind of padding these numbers. Terry's a bit touchdown dependent, but he has been an alpha receiver in fantasy as of late. Back in the top 10, it's taken him a while, but he has been creeping up. Justin Jefferson averaging 15.7 points. It could be even higher if not for a dropped touchdown that saved my subscriber league team. I did advance thanks to the drop touchdown by Jefferson. Obviously, though, if you have him, you have to start him. You still got a good game. It just could have been even better last week against the Bears. Number 9 is a bit shocking, but Keenan Allen has been a go-to target for Caleb Williams lately. Also averaging 15.7 points, tied with Justin Jefferson for wide receiver 9 the last month. Touchdowns are huge, and against Detroit, I see a very good matchup. I think Keenan Allen is worth starting at the moment. Right behind him, T. Higgins, who's been a staple in your lineup all season. T. Higgins, a very reliable option to get you over 14 points. But number 12 is Courtland Sutton, who's right behind T. Higgins at 15.2. And with 9 targets for both of them, they're both reliable options. Bo Nix really gets the ball reliably to Courtland Sutton. That isn't changing. Since last year, Sutton and Sean Payton's offense has been a good fantasy receiver. I don't think you're benching Courtland Sutton. I also don't think you're benching DJ Moore, who's even more involved than Keenan Allen, but Keenan Allen is a little bit better because of the touchdowns. Both top two Bears receivers are very reliable in fantasy, both going over 15 points per game. So that's the top 13. Right behind them, we have 4 players tied for wide receiver 14, and that's Amon-Ra St. Brown, Ladd McConkey, JSN, and CeeDee Lamb. A few weeks ago, I pointed out a trend in these charts where Jakobi Meyers and Ladd McConkey were top 20 receivers, and they were well overshadowing guys like Justin Jefferson and CeeDee Lamb. Since that point, both Jefferson and Lamb have reclaimed top 20 status. Jakobi Meyers has fallen a little bit, but Ladd McConkey has stayed put. While he did miss a game with injury, McConkey is very reliable. He's tied with St. Brown. Both players are averaging 95 receiving yards per game. So while they did miss out on Quentin Johnson last year, JSN was drafted right before QJ. Ladd McConkey really filling in, playing just as well as JSN right now. So JSN is in his second year, Ladd McConkey's a rookie, and they're both on par with St. Brown and CeeDee Lamb, both top 5 picks in this year's draft. Really impressive numbers from 2 young receivers. With St. Brown and CeeDee Lamb, you're not benching either of them. To see them in the top 15 is not a shock at all. If anything, you would expect them to be top 5, not this low. But let's move on. Next on the list would be Nico Collins, who had 2 touchdowns last week, but almost no yards. Nico was very touchdown dependent, only 17 yards last week on 4 catches. I would be a little concerned on Nico, but odds are you just have to keep rolling him out there. It worked out, but the yardage, a bit concerning, has been falling down a bit as of late. But then A.J. Brown did have a big blow-up game last week. We knew it was coming. Once he was complaining about getting the ball, you knew last week he would probably bounce back for targets. But even DeVonta Smith had a big week. The Eagles decided to throw the ball. I'm not convinced they're going to do that all of the time. I wouldn't be shocked at all if we saw a big run game from Saquon where A.J. Brown has another 4-catch, 50-yard game. And no touchdown could really burn you. So A.J. Brown, still a bit scary, but after last week, you're probably still trusting him. And then George Pickens has missed 2 straight games with injury, but if he does come back, he is probably a lock in your lineup as a top 20 option. And then Tyreek Hill, one of these touchdowns a bit fluky, but it still counts. He's a bit more of a 11, 12 point average type of guy than this 13.1, but still, that touchdown that bounced off Jonnu Smith's hands does pad these numbers a little bit. 72 yards per game from Tyreek. Not bad, but last week he really let you down on the road at the Texans. Malik Nabers, also a top 25 receiver. The volume is just so safe and secure with Malik Nabers. 11.5 targets per game. That ranks only second in the NFL in the last 4 games, behind Ja'Marr Chase. No other player is seeing more targets than Malik Nabers other than Ja'Marr Chase. So that keeps the floor high, but obviously the quarterback play is pretty lackluster, nothing special, and the upside is missing. The touchdowns are not really there for Nabers on a consistent basis. Only 1 touchdown last month for Malik Nabers. But behind him, a player I really don't believe will offer this type of value anymore is Cedric Tillman, who has missed, I believe, 3+ weeks with a concussion. Kind of shocking that it's been that long, but he was playing very well before he went down with that concussion. But with DTR, not Jameis Winston, I really don't trust this volume to repeat for Tillman. He had 8 targets per game before going down, and I really don't see that turning in to the same level of touchdown production. He had 3 touchdowns his last 4 games. I'd probably give up hope on Tillman, even if he returns this week against the Bengals. Right behind him would be Adam Thielen, who I don't totally believe is legit, because some of his biggest games were while Jalen Coker was out, and as someone who wasn't really paying attention to Coker, I was very shocked to see Jalen Coker have a monster game last week, and Coker's not far behind him. Coker is wide receiver 28, averaging 11.3 points, and Adam Thielen at wide receiver 24 is right above him. So both Thielen and Coker are actually very much involved in that offense, and Xavier Legette is doubtful. Bryce Young is stepping up. If the Cardinals fall flat on the road this week, then both Thielen and Jalen Coker could be very legit flex plays. Not bad options. There is some upside for both of them. Coker has 2 touchdowns the last 4 games, and Thielen only 1, but Thielen is also averaging 77 yards per game. Both players are pretty efficient for high yardage totals. But after Adam Thielen, we have Jakobi Meyers, Khalil Shakir, Jaylen Waddle between those 2 Panthers receivers. And Meyers, shockingly, is the wide receiver 3 in terms of targets. There are no other threats other than Brock Bowers there. And with some injuries at receiver, I don't see the volume changing for Jakobi Meyers. So he doesn't have a touchdown, but the floor is good for 7 catches, 86 yards. 12 points represents Meyers' floor in fantasy. However, last week with Desmond Ridder was a little bit different. He had 5 catches on 9 targets for 59 yards, and maybe the ceiling does get capped even further with Desmond Ridder. But Meyers is a very safe floor play. You're not going to bust if you start Jakobi Meyers. And the same applies with Khalil Shakir. While I don't really trust him to find touchdowns generally, those have been hitting. Shakir has 2 touchdowns the last 4 games, and on the season he's averaging exactly 60 yards. That is the floor for Shakir. You get about 6 catches, 60 yards, and 9 points is a bust-proof floor from Khalil Shakir. Beyond Jalen Waddle, Jalen Coker, this name might shock you. It's Tim Patrick, who does have 3 touchdowns the last 3 games. With Khalif Raymond on IR and with Dave Montgomery going down, I don't see the volume really changing for Tim Patrick. They need him to step up. He's going to be on the field, and he will run routes. There will be plenty of targets that are valuable in the red zone that continue to go in favor of Tim Patrick. So maybe you don't fully trust him, but he's an interesting flex play. I think just like Jalen Coker, you could start Tim Patrick off the wire and have a very high ceiling if you are desperate. Beyond Tim Patrick is more of a floor play with Jauan Jennings, who had 2 terrible games in the snow and in the rain. The last 2 games have been very rough for the Niners. Some rough weather in Miami. I expect Jauan Jennings to bounce back. But Drake London, I'm not quite sure how much I trust this week because Michael Penix is going to be the starter in Atlanta. Obviously, Cousins was favoring London at a high rate, 9 targets per game this season, and that probably doesn't change. If anything, maybe the touchdown does hit for London. So I'm going to be hopeful and optimistic about London, but odds are he carries a lot of risk. With a new quarterback, we don't know exactly what's going to happen in that Falcons offense. It is a good matchup, though, this week against the Giants. Maybe you'll take that chance. It could work out. Penix played insanely well in college last season. I'm kind of surprised they didn't make the change sooner in Atlanta. But behind London, a big game for DeVonta Smith last week, but he had been underperforming before that, and I'm not convinced I actually trust the Eagles to be all of a sudden back to a pass-first team. So DeVonta Smith, a bit risky, but obviously some high upside. We saw him go over 100 yards last week, and that could happen again. He had 12 targets, and we didn't really see that coming. He's only averaging less than 7 in the last month. I expect that to fall back down to average. But number 33, Jalen McMillan, has really stepped up after coming off of the injury list. He was banged up for a couple weeks, but now he's really stepping up, and without Chris Godwin, this Bucs offense looks really volatile. So I could see another big game for McMillan looming right around the corner. And against the Cowboys on Sunday night, I do see Baker Mayfield having a very good game. I think McMillan still has just as much upside as like any other flex play. So McMillan, really good option lately, and a player I believed in coming out of the draft. I loved all 3 Husky wide receivers, and right now McMillan is playing the best football of the 3 of them. Behind McMillan would be MVS, who did fall back down to earth, but is still averaging over 10 points per game. At wide receiver 34, you could do worse than MVS, an average of 60 yards per game, but it doesn't feel like it's the same value in that offense without Derek Carr. The deep shots are a lot more reliable to hit with Derek Carr, but with Rattler, I assume there's going to be some garbage time no matter what against the Packers. The weather, though, might play a factor. It's a revenge game for MVS. Maybe he hits on a deep shot. But after that, it's DeAndre Hopkins, Marvin Mims. And Hopkins is a bit more reliable, but with 2 touchdowns, that's really what's padding these numbers. Xavier Worthy is actually a bit safer in terms of floor. He's right behind him at wide receiver 38, averaging 9.7 points. And Worthy only has 1 touchdown. It came on the ground last week, but is averaging closer to 60 yards per game. Hopkins, only 48 yards per game. So I view the 2 of them almost identically. I actually prefer Xavier Worthy a little bit in terms of upside, I think the ceiling is higher with Xavier Worthy. But Marvin Mims, his stats are pretty fluky thanks to a 90-plus yard touchdown, and I am definitely not trusting Mims in my lineup. But then Keon Coleman, also kind of hard to trust. The volume isn't really high. Last week he only had one catch, but it was worth 64 yards. When Keon Coleman gets the ball, he is explosive down the field, and there's also plenty of upside for those deep shots. But after Keon Coleman, then there was Xavier Worthy, Garrett Wilson, and Wilson has taken a backseat to Davante Adams the last few weeks. It's just not the same situation anymore, as Adams has really blown up in New York. But then it's Jameson Williams, who only has one touchdown last month, just like Garrett Wilson, both averaging 57 yards, less than 5 catches per game. Kind of volatile, but you know that Jameson Williams could have a blow-up performance at any time. He's a huge threat deep down the field, very high value ceiling type of player. But then Cooper Kupp put up a bagel last week. He plummeted in these rankings down to wide receiver 41, and he probably bounces back in a major way with extra rest. I'm going to read into the weather really shutting him down. For some reason, not a single Ram or 49er last week found the end zone, and Kupp cost you. He had 3 targets, not a single catch. Meanwhile, Puka Nacua was the only effective receiver in that game entirely. So I'm not going to entirely panic on Kupp, but obviously he probably cost you an advance in the playoffs. If you started Kupp last week, I'm sure you lost. A bagel is hard to come back from. But Rashad Bateman right behind him, pretty boom bust type of player. Sometimes it hits, but in general, you don't expect 80 yards and 2 touchdowns like he put up last week against the Giants. But behind Bateman would be Nick Westbrook-Akine, and the touchdown streak has fallen off, and he is questionable this week. I'd be worried against the Colts. It's not a good matchup at all. I wouldn't trust him. But with Mason Rudolph, maybe it does work out. Then it's Calvin Austin, who's reliant on some deep touchdowns to hit against the Ravens. I don't think I'd trust it, but if Pickens doesn't play, maybe Austin does step up. There's probably going to be some targets available. Then these next 3, we expected a lot more from them when we drafted them. We have Michael Pittman Jr. here at 8.8 points, tied with Calvin Austin. Then Calvin Ridley and Zay Flowers, and they've all been really unreliable floor plays. Not good options, barely even top 50 in the ranks the last month. So you need a touchdown from them, and I'm not really convinced it happens. Only Flowers has a touchdown, and he's actually averaging less points than Pittman and Ridley, who have no touchdowns. So more just a floor option with these 3. You know there's a high ceiling. There's a chance it really works out, but at the moment, they're not playing well enough to trust. I would be benching them. And then there are a few like standout names beyond the top 50, but Marvin Harrison Jr. not playing very well, tied with Kendrick Bourne at 8 points per game, both putting up 47 yards and a touchdown. I don't trust Harrison at all right now. The Cardinals offense really only runs through James Conner and Trey McBride. Marvin Harrison's deep shots are kind of hit or miss, very fluky when they work out. And then all 3 Packers receivers are all kind of clustered in the 7 to 8 point range. We have Romeo Doubs at 7.9, Jaden Reed at 7.7, and then Christian Watson at 7.2. Interestingly, Watson actually has the highest floor. He's averaging 60 yards, but no touchdowns. Meanwhile, Romeo Doubs only 35 yards per game and 2 touchdowns. And then Jaden Reed also 2 touchdowns with about 34 yards per game. So I kind of view them all in the same tier. I think if you're starting a Packers receiver, there is no clear reason to feel more confident in one over the other. So while Watson maybe doesn't have the same ceiling without any touchdowns, it could definitely pivot back to him at any time. And against the Saints in the cold weather, maybe they're not good starts on Monday night. I wouldn't trust any Packers receiver. None of them are top 50 at the moment. Otherwise, the only like big names are just like major letdowns outside the top 60. We have DK Metcalf at wide receiver 62. And since I mentioned I thought he'd been overrated, he has really shit the bed. Last week, I thought maybe he could bounce back in a good matchup, but nope, he was terrible against the Packers. Even with 2 top corners injured on Green Bay's defense, Metcalf was awful, only 28 yards on 3 catches. He has not found the end zone in well over a month, and only 1 game in that stretch with over 60 yards. Metcalf is brutal right now, but Josh Downs also really let me down. I endorsed Downs after I looked into the cornerback matchup last week, and damn, that was a bad call. Downs was terrible. Trusting Anthony Richardson is a very risky bet. And then Elijah Moore has fallen off with no touchdowns for him. He's not a safe play. With no Jameis Winston either, the ceiling is gone for Elijah Moore. And then Darnell Mooney has also fallen off a cliff, completely cratered, wide receiver 67. And then Tank Dell at wide receiver 69, 5.7 points. Dell has been a terrible player this season. But then Amari Cooper, I don't really know what happened. He played last week, played like 30 snaps, but got a bagel. They had a shootout against the Lions, and Amari Cooper didn't see a single target. I don't know what is going on with Amari Cooper in Buffalo. But lastly, the biggest bust on the season is probably Deebo Samuel. Wide receiver 90 in the last month. 3.1 points for Deebo. I told you he would get the opportunity last week. He was worth starting. He had 10 plays in terms of targets and rush attempts. 10 opportunities. Deebo had 3 catches, 16 yards, and that quintessential drop that maybe would have been a game-winning touchdown if he got it. So Deebo's just terrible right now. Not a single game in the last 4 with over 5 points. Deebo is ass at the moment. So those are all the scoring trends I wanted to show you, but now I think it's time to move on, show you a different chart. And these are the matchups this week. All of the upgrades and downgrades, positive matchups in general. With this chart, it's the same type of theme in terms of data points. The blue dots represent the last 5 games, more recent production, and then the red dots are the season average. How have they been performing on a per game basis this year? So we can pick up on teams that are trending up or down. League average is about 28 points, and only until you go over 30 do I really consider it like a decent upgrade. But we clearly have a tier above this 35 plus. These top 4, even the 5th best matchup is a sizable advantage compared to the rest. So number 1 this week would be the Buffalo Bills, and the Bills get the Patriots in the snow. I don't think you're starting Kendrick Bourne or Demario Douglas. This matchup is kind of wasted on the Patriots. But number 2, we have the Vikings, who've given up a shit ton of yards lately, 214 receiving yards per game, along with 5 touchdowns, 17 catches. Every opponent has to throw like crazy on the Vikings. So I do see some upside for JSN and DK Metcalf. Lockett's pretty irrelevant, but against the Vikings, I would be starting JSN. Maybe if you're desperate, you'll roll the dice with Metcalf, who's been terrible as of late. Atlanta is also a good matchup, over 36 points per game from them. And on the season, they're also top 10 as well. I do trust all of these top 3 matchups as positive ones. But for Atlanta, they go up against the Giants this week, and that means Malik Nabers does get a big upgrade. If he's active, he's questionable at the moment. I expect him to play. Then Nabers is a high-end flex play this week. And then lately, the Chargers defense has really been vulnerable. On the year, they're one of the best, but in the last month, they're terrible, not just against the pass, but also on the ground. They can't really stop anyone right now. So not really sure what's going on, but on Thursday, perhaps they turn it around against the Broncos. Maybe Bo Nix as a rookie doesn't play well for the second game this season in division, but I would be starting Courtland Sutton for sure. Based on these trends, you have to give Sutton a big upgrade. I don't know if I'd trust any other player though in Denver other than Nix at quarterback. In New Orleans, that's also a big upgrade matchup. On the year, they've always allowed over 31 points per game. So very reliable upgrade here, and that's for the Packers receivers. I don't know how much you trust starting Jayden Reed, Christian Watson, or Romeo Doubs, but based on these numbers, there should be a big game. They allow 192 yards per game in the last 5, so really big upgrade. These Saints give up a lot of points to receivers. And then lately, it has been a decent upgrade for the Jacksonville Jaguars opponents. The Jags on the season are more league average, but lately over 31.7 points per game to the position. So that means Jakobi Meyers does get another upgrade. I don't really trust him to score touchdowns, but the volume for Jakobi is so high in this matchup, I would be starting him as a good play. But then Jerry Jeudy, Cedric Tillman, and Elijah Moore, if they're all active, technically get an upgrade against the Bengals here, but yikes. Do you really feel good about that? I wouldn't. I don't think the Dorian Thompson-Robinson experience is trustworthy at all. So maybe Jerry Jeudy has just earned so much faith of yours that you have to start him, but yikes. I would not feel good about that at all. The Jets are also recently a good matchup. We saw Brian Thomas Jr. torch them, and I thought maybe with Sauce Gardner getting healthy, he could play well, but he hasn't looked good at all. The Jets defense is very injured. They also lost DJ Reed and another backup cornerback. Their second, third string corners are banged up, and you could really play well on the Jets. So Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp should have a good game. I think Kupp will bounce back in a major way. Puka, always a lock in your lineup. And then Brian Thomas Jr. also gets a big upgrade. The Las Vegas Raiders have been very vulnerable to receivers the last 5 games. So Brian Thomas is playing lights out. You have to start him. I wouldn't start Parker Washington, but Brian Thomas gets a big upgrade. And then lastly, the top 10 matchup that is also above 30 points per game would be Dallas, and that goes to the Buccaneers. Mike Evans is a trustworthy play, but McMillan has also come alive lately. I would trust McMillan as a decent flex play, more of a low-end option, but high ceiling in this matchup. It definitely offers a boost. And then at 29.6 points, maybe you'll consider the Bears a good matchup, but I think at this point I would pass. The Lions' offensive weapons are always in your lineup, regardless. And then lastly, top 12 would be the Steelers against Baltimore, but in that division game, I don't know how much I really trust Zay Flowers. He's been in a slump lately, and the Steelers-Ravens game is usually low scoring. I don't expect many touchdowns over there. So those are all the upgrades, the positive matchups, but now let's pivot to the downgrades, where I think these bottom 4 are clearly in a tier below everyone else. Then there's the bottom 8, this other tier of the next 4 or 5 teams, and then tied at the 10th and 11th worst matchup at 25.4 points. I think that is the cutoff point in terms of downgrades. Everything else is kind of like just back to league average. I wouldn't really worry about it too much in the middle of this chart. But at the bottom, the worst matchup would be the Eagles going up against the Commanders. So Terry McLaurin is in store for a rough matchup here. The last time he played them, he only had 1 reception for 10 yards, and I would be very worried about Terry in this spot. But given his production this season, I think you have to start him. It was his worst game on the road at Philly. Maybe at home, he turns it around. Let's hope for the best, but I am very, very worried about McLaurin this week. But shockingly, the Colts are also a bad matchup. Only the last 5 games on the season, they give up closer to 25 points. Lately, though, 20.2, that is on par with the Eagles. So Colts, tough matchup for Calvin Ridley and Nick Westbrook-Ikine. With Mason Rudolph, I don't think I'd be trusting either of them against Indianapolis. The Niners are also a tough matchup. Weather has been a factor, though, and maybe Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, and Malik Washington at home are still decent options, but Waddle is hurt. Waddle didn't practice on Wednesday. Maybe Malik Washington is going to step up. It's more likely that Jonnu Smith benefits the most, not Malik Washington or Tyreek Hill. But number 29 in terms of matchups, bottom 4, this last team in this tier would be the Cardinals, who go up against Adam Thielen and Jalen Coker. So we mentioned some upside for both of them, but how much do you trust them against Arizona? Maybe that is fool's gold. But the Washington Commanders, also a tough matchup with Marshawn Lattimore. They should be even more difficult as of now, but A.J. Brown, DeVonta Smith just went off last week. How much are you really benching those type of players if they helped you advance in the wildcard round? So probably just going to trust your studs and start the Eagles wide receivers, but maybe this is a landmine to worry about. Next up would be the Giants, who get the Falcons and Michael Penix. So Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod, not as safe as you might think, especially with that quarterback situation. I'd probably only take a shot on London. I don't think I'd be that confident in starting any Falcons receiver this week beyond Drake London. Even that is a gamble. But next up would be the Seahawks as a downgrade. But for Jefferson and Addison, they've been so good, I wouldn't be benching the Vikings receivers. Then it's the Packers, so a revenge game for MVS, as I mentioned, but MVS has been fading. With no Derek Carr, I don't trust MVS as much. And then the Lions are also technically a good secondary as of late. This game is in Chicago, and usually the Bears play a lot better at home, and on defense, maybe they do have a shot. Last 2 matchups for upgrades would be Miami for Jauan Jennings and Deebo Samuel. I think at this point you have to completely fade Deebo Samuel. You just can't trust Deebo anymore. Jauan should probably bounce back, though. I wouldn't completely write off Jauan Jennings. He's had a good season this year. And then lastly, the Rams are technically a tough matchup for the Jets receivers. Davante Adams has just played so well, I wouldn't bench him. And then Garrett Wilson has kind of taken a back seat, but still an interesting flex option in general. So those are all of the matchup stats as well as scoring trends. And we've taken a half hour to go over these charts. So we're going to talk about the rankings, and I'm going to go over them from a tier-based perspective. In terms of must-starts, I think the top 8 receivers are locks in your lineup. Jamar Chase, who the fuck is benching Jamar Chase? Number 2, I'm rolling with Amon-Ra St. Brown. With no Dave Montgomery, they have to throw the ball even more. And while he doesn't play well against the Bears, no one's benching St. Brown in the playoffs. You're also not benching Puka Nacua at all. He's been lights out, also averaging over 20 points. This one's obvious, but then based on the hot streak lately, I think Davante Adams has to be upgraded heavily. I have him in the top 4 this week. Adams had almost 200 yards last week. Are you really going to bench him? It's a Rodgers versus Stafford matchup. I think there's going to be a lot of passing yards in this one. Adams will be the go-to target. Number 5 is Mike Evans against Dallas on Sunday night. The Hall of Fame player will also have a elite performance. This is a top 10 matchup as well. The Cowboys give up 173 yards per game. Evans will go well over 100 once again. At number 6, I do have Jefferson at Seattle, and maybe the weather's going to be a factor. Expect a lot of rain in Seattle this week, and perhaps Darnold does get shut down. He's looked amazing in the dome in Minnesota, but on the road at Seattle, it could be a whole different situation. You're not benching Jefferson, but the rain is why I didn't rank him in the top 5. Number 7, I have A.J. Brown, who after last week, you think maybe they'll keep sending him targets now that he complained enough, but obviously it could burn you. He did have a very rough stretch where he wasn't even as good as MVS for a while, and A.J. Brown could fall back. Against the Commanders is actually a rough matchup, but historically he goes over 98 yards per game. Against Washington, that's his average, his last 5, and I would trust him. He also has 5 touchdowns in those 5 games. A.J. Brown is averaging 18.2 points per game versus the Commanders. You're not benching A.J. Brown. And then while 17 yards was a big red flag for Nico Collins last week, it also came with 2 touchdowns on only 4 catches. Against the Chiefs, it's not a downgrade at all. The Chiefs are going to require them to throw the ball. The Chiefs have a great run defense, and if they stop Joe Mixon, the only other weapon that the Texans have is Nico Collins. So Collins will be fine. I'm definitely keeping Nico Collins in my lineup. He's been a league winner this season, but I think beyond him is a tier break. I think there's just a little bit more risk. It's not quite the same equation, even if you're getting a stud wide receiver 1 like Brian Thomas Jr. Are you really telling me that Mac Jones is that reliable that you have to rank Brian Thomas in the top 5? I almost did it. The matchup for him is top 9. He played so well, but I've been such a big fan of him all season long. I wasn't going to let myself get carried away and rank him above Justin Jefferson. But right behind Nico Collins at number 9, I think Thomas is a true lock in your lineup, a stud rookie, and he's by far had the best season in my opinion, well above Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Nabers. I know Nabers has a ton of targets, but still Thomas is more consistent, and he's doing it with even less around him, in my opinion. To do it with Mac Jones is insane, and I just love him so much. Brian Thomas Jr. is a league-winning rookie receiver, my favorite by far and away. But at number 10, I think T. Higgins is still a top 10 play and a usually reliable option for about 90 yards and a touchdown. Like 15 points from Higgins appears to be his floor. That's his average last 4 games, averaging 15.3 points. Usually, T. Higgins is a safe bet as a top 10 play. But I will mention against the Browns in his last 4 games, against them, he does have 1 bagel in that stretch. It happened last year. If you recall, like week 2, he was terrible. He was injured, though, and I'm not convinced it really counts in terms of like hitting the panic button. I wouldn't overreact to that 1 game. In general, otherwise, in those other 4 games, he's averaging 10 points per game, including that bagel, and I still trust him a decent amount. If you remove the bagel in those other 3 games, you would be getting roughly 13.3 points per game. So trust T. Higgins. He will probably find the end zone more than likely every week. But number 11, Courtland Sutton has been money in the bank this season, very reliable, high floor play, and the Chargers are a top 4 matchup lately. There's no reason to downgrade Sutton at all. His last 4 games versus the Chargers, he's averaging 10.1 points per game, only 41 yards per game, but with 3 touchdowns. I think it's kind of a safe assumption that Sutton will find the end zone. He's averaging 77 yards his last 4 with Bo Nix. I trust Sutton's floor a lot. Just like Higgins, he's a top 12 play lately, averaging over 15 points per game. At number 12, I think a big upgrade is deserved for JSN this week. The Vikings are the second best matchup for receivers lately, giving up 214 receiving yards per game to the position. And while they've only allowed 5 touchdowns, I trust JSN dramatically. I think no matter what, JSN has to be in your lineup. He's well overtaken DK Metcalf as the top receiver in Washington. So Ryan Grubb always sends him a ton of targets. JSN is thriving right now, and I would be starting him. At home versus Minnesota, he should pop off. I think he goes over 100 yards. Number 13 and 14, I have both Bears receivers. I got DJ Moore and Keenan Allen at home versus Detroit, and I expect a touchdown for both of them. I really see a potential shootout. The Lions defense is brutal. The weather could be a factor. It's going to be snowing all throughout Saturday night, but it's supposed to stop before this game takes place. So if we get to kickoff and you find out that the weather is still going to persist, if there's still snowfall for this matchup, then I will be fading both players. But assuming that's not the case, I would trust them. I think the run game has been completely eviscerated in Chicago. Everything runs through Caleb Williams in the passing game. So these two players are reliably scoring touchdowns. DJ Moore, his last 3 games versus Detroit, is averaging 18.2 points as a Chicago Bear, and with 11.7 targets, 7 catches, 87 yards, and 3 touchdowns, he's an extremely reliable play against the Lions. And lately, he's also been averaging 15 points per game. DJ Moore is a lock in your lineup, a true stud at the moment, a top 15 receiver right now. But Keenan is even playing better than him. I mentioned that in the charts. Keenan is getting even more targets, over 10 per game, and with 4 touchdowns, he's the go-to target in the red zone for Caleb Williams. So expect another touchdown for both of them. If we look back to week 13 at Detroit, his only game against the Lions as a Bear, Keenan Allen had 8 targets, 5 catches, 73 yards, and 2 touchdowns. That's 21.8 points in half PPR. And on his career, he has 4 games against Detroit, but he also owned them as well. Keenan in his career was averaging 24.3 points per game in fantasy against the Lions, an average of 134 yards per game and 4 touchdowns in 4 games against the Lions. So he always plays well. Just like last week against the Vikings, I looked at the matchup stats. Keenan played dominant football against Minnesota, and just like the Lions, he plays dominant football as well against them. So definitely trust both of them. While I don't trust Odunze at all right now, I do trust DJ Moore and Keenan Allen. Even if they're not as competitive as I think, there's going to be at worst garbage time where Caleb will pad the stats in the second half. So trust Keenan and DJ Moore. They'll get some cheap garbage time touchdowns at the very least. But at 15, I'm also trusting Jordan Addison no matter what. At this point, he's just too productive to bench, over 100 yards per game in his last 4, with 4 touchdowns, an average of 19.7 points on 9 targets per game. Earlier in the season, there was a rough patch for Addison where he was only getting like 5 or 6 targets per game. Now that has increased by over 50%. The volume is locked in for Addison. At this point, I do trust Darnold, but perhaps the rain could shut down this Vikings offense. That's the only red flag to worry about. Why I didn't rank him any higher. I almost had him top 10. Then I remembered the weather, and I was like, yeah, maybe we lower Addison just a little bit. But at number 16, I am fading Terry McLaurin a little bit this week. But at number 16, I can't bench Terry. He's just been so good. The wide receiver 8 overall the last month. He's averaging 16.6 points with 3 touchdowns in that span. And while the yards isn't really that reliable for him, the touchdowns almost always hit. And Terry is a typically safe option in general. So I would be starting him, but I'm obviously worried about the Eagles matchup. It is the worst matchup on paper in the last 5 games, the bottom tier matchup overall. So maybe they shut him down. That's what happened the last time he played them. In week 11 at Philadelphia, Jaden Daniels only sent Terry 2 targets in that game. He only had 1 reception for 10 yards. No touchdown. Terry only put up 1.5 fantasy point against the Eagles. So maybe this is a huge fade spot. I could envision a massive bust performance from Terry, but he's been so good this season. I think it's a no risk it, no biscuit type of situation. I would hate to lose in fantasy while Terry had 2 touchdowns on my bench. and I didn't trust him in this spot. But obviously I'm concerned. I normally rank him top 10 as of late, and against Quinion Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, I am downgrading him substantially, about 10 spots overall. I almost put him top 6. If not for the matchup, I would have trusted him as at worst a top 10 play. I probably would have had him above T. Higgins, right behind Brian Thomas at the lowest. But I'm bumping him down 6 spots lower. I think against the Eagles, it's a big concern, and Vic Fangio will probably make an emphasis to lock him up. He's really the only weapon they have. If you shut down Terry McLaurin, they only have Zach Ertz and Brian Robinson. I think you can beat them if Terry puts up a shit game. So I'm worried about it, but I think I have to trust him in my lineup. I wouldn't be benching Terry, but obviously lower expectations against the worst matchup in the NFL. Number 17, I got CeeDee Lamb versus Tampa Bay, and maybe this game is enough of a shootout where it really pads the numbers for CeeDee, but in general, the touchdown's a bit hard to bet on with him, and while the volume's going to be there, he'll get 9-10 targets. I don't really trust the ceiling this week against Tampa. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's worth starting at number 17. I'm not telling you to bench CeeDee Lamb, but I don't think he'll be that top 10 player that we drafted. It's just not the same thing with Cooper Rush at quarterback. But lately, CeeDee Lamb is actually tied with Ladd McConkey in terms of points per game. Both have 14.3 on average, and McConkey is way safer in terms of yards. Ladidi is averaging 95 yards per game in his last 4. While he was banged up, almost didn't play last week, he did get back on the field, and they're really going to need him against the Broncos. But just like Terry McLaurin, a really tough matchup for him against Patrick Surtain, I would definitely be fading McConkey a little bit, but he's been so safe, so reliable. He's really the only target I think Justin Herbert actually trusts, and with no run game, you know they're going to feed him at least like 7-8 targets once again. So McConkey should probably pay off, but there's always a world that Pat Surtain completely shuts him down. If you look back to week 6 in the first game between these two teams, with McConkey at least, McConkey wasn't great. He had 8 targets, 4 catches, 43 yards, no touchdown, only 6.3 points in a win at Denver. So this game's at home. Maybe it's a different story, but I think it's more of a defensive battle, a low-scoring game against the Broncos, and I am not convinced McConkey will find the end zone. I think he's just a high-end floor play for about 6 catches, 75 yards. That's my projection for McConkey. Maybe he also finds the end zone and really pays off, but that's why I have him at the bottom of this tier. Just like McLaurin and CeeDee Lamb, I'm a bit concerned about the ceiling this week, but I think based on recent production, you have to start Ladd in your lineup. Then I think we're dropping down a tier. I think there's a lot more risk that enters the equation, and we're more talking about flex plays in general at this point. But Jerry Jeudy, I think you still kind of have to take a flyer on. Like, just like Tyreek Hill behind him, there have been some really rough games for players like this, and if you do get burned, I don't think you'll be surprised, but I think it is worth that gamble because Jeudy has just been so lights out in the last month. An average of 19.2 points, 123 yards per game, and 2 touchdowns, but obviously those numbers all kind of happened for the most part in that Broncos game. At least they're padding the stats a lot. So I don't think he'll be a top 10 receiver again. I think Judy's run as elite in fantasy is probably over now that Jameis Winston is not the quarterback this week. With Dorian Thompson-Robinson, I really have a lot of red flags surrounding Jerry Jeudy, but given his ceiling, I think you'll probably still gamble on it. The Bengals are a top 7 matchup. They have not had a good defense at all this season, and Cam Taylor-Britt is probably going to get torched on a few routes by Jerry Jeudy, but they do give up 162 yards per game on 10 catches. They give up some deep shots. That's 16.2 yards per reception, and that's well above league average. So that's what leads to 8 touchdowns as well, and maybe the ceiling is still available for Jeudy, but I would definitely be hitting the panic button a little bit now that Winston got benched for DTR. But at this point, the risk factor does increase tremendously overall, and no one really has a higher ceiling at the moment. So Jeudy does represent the top of this tier at wide receiver 19. I'd probably put him in my lineup this week. And number 20, I'm also probably going to start Tyreek Hill versus the Niners. He had a terrible game last week against the Texans. That was kind of a shocker. But this week, Jaylen Waddle is banged up. He didn't practice on Wednesday, and expect even more volume for Tyreek Hill. Against the Niners, you know, it's a big, important game for the head coach, Mike McDaniel. It's a reunion between him and his former mentor, Kyle Shanahan. So I do see a bit of a shootout in this game. I would expect a high point total. And the Niners, while they are a bottom 3 matchup lately, weather's been a major reason why. In the snow against Buffalo and the rain against the Rams, in Miami, it's not going to be a factor at all. So Tyreek Hill at home usually plays a lot better. I would expect a high volume of targets for him, especially if Waddle doesn't play. And just like Jeudy, the ceiling is still pretty high. You wouldn't be surprised if Tyreek Hill finally gets back to elite status, but there have been some really underwhelming games from him. I am a bit concerned. I'm kind of hitting the panic button on Tyreek Hill, but I'm giving him one more week inside the top 20. I was wrong to start him last week, and if you advance despite that recommendation, I think this week he's a decent low-end wide receiver 2, more of a flex play, but I still think he's worth starting. At number 21, I'd also be starting Cooper Kupp. I know the bagel was detrimental. You probably did not advance because of it, but I think against the Jets with their injuries in the secondary, I think he has a major bounce back. I only really trust Puka at a major level. At the moment, Kupp ranks as wide receiver 41 the last month, but that Jets matchup doesn't scare me. It's probably a shootout, and Cooper Kupp may be too low in these rankings. I could understand ranking him above like Terry McLaurin. He could be anywhere between wide receiver 16 and 21, but after the bagel last week, only 3 targets. Yikes. So only at number 21, there's enough red flags to be concerned, but just like Jerry Jeudy, Tyreek Hill, I think they are worth a start in the second round of the fantasy playoffs. Number 22 might not play. It's George Pickens at Baltimore, but he's been really productive. He's kind of representing their entire offense in the passing game, and obviously they'll need him a lot. If active, I would start Pickens against the Ravens, but they have played a lot better on defense lately. The Ravens are not the great matchup they were to start the year. They traded for Tre'Davious White, and since then, they have stepped up a lot. The coaching probably improves the defense even more off the bye last week. So I'm a bit worried about the ceiling for Pickens, but if he plays, the floor is going to be high. The volume will be very reliable. I would be starting Pickens. He's an explosive option, worth a start in general. But number 23, we got Malik Nabers at the Falcons, who's technically questionable, was limited in practice, but not a threat to miss. I'm definitely expecting Nabers to be available on Sunday. But this matchup against the Falcons is top 3. While I don't really trust Drew Lock or Tommy DeVito or Tim Boyle, I don't know who the starting quarterback will be. I still think Nabers is probably worth starting. The volume's just too high for Nabers, 11.5 targets per game. That keeps the floor reliably in the double-digit range. Nabers is not a player to bench. In an upgrade of a matchup like this, he's a very high-end flex play. I'm not ready to rank him top 20. I'd much rather have Lad McConkey or Brian Thomas this week, but still at wide receiver 23, I would be starting Malik Nabers most of the time. At 24, another player that's questionable is Jakobi Meyers versus Jacksonville, and he didn't practice that much last week, but did play, and I think it'll probably be the same situation this week against the Jags. It's a very good matchup, top 6 at the moment, and the Jags just gave up almost 200 yards to Davante Adams. I think Myers probably goes over at least 85. That's what his average is. He's averaging 86 yards per game on 11.3 targets, 7 catches. Just like Nabers, he is bust proof because the floor is so high thanks to 11 plus targets per week. So only him and Bowers get really any targets. It's them and Amir Abdullah, no one else in Vegas. Myers' floor is very bust proof, a big upgrade in terms of matchups. I would be starting Myers as a reliable flex play this week. And then Khalil Shakir, I always have him here. Like, it's kind of shocking that there isn't like one game that really has me like afraid to start him, or one game that is like, oh yeah, now I really trust Khalil Shakir. It's always the same with him. I always have him wide receiver 25 to 30, depending on the week. He always hovers in these 6 spots, but I kind of trust him this week against the Patriots. The touchdowns have been hitting a bit more for him, but there is going to be some snow in this game, and maybe the passing game really struggles. Let's circle back on this ranking later in the week. If it's going to be actively snowing in the game, I will be dropping him down a tier, but probably still remain in the top 30. We'll see what happens. Based on the forecast, you might want to fade Shakir a little bit. But then 26, I got Jauan Jennings at Miami, who is in a bit of a slump lately, but weather's been a major factor why. And on the road at Miami, I would expect to bounce back for the entire Niners offense in general. They get extra rest to prepare. They played last Thursday, and I think Jennings will be heavily targeted, close to 8 targets once again from Brock Purdy. Feels like the most reliable receiver. Beyond George Kittle, I think Purdy trusts Jauan Jennings a lot more than Debo at the moment. So Debo's not going to get force-fed like he was last week. Jennings will get back in the mix, heavily targeted this week at the Dolphins. But then 27, I got Adam Thielen versus Arizona, who was overshadowed by Jalen Coker last week, but still is capable of putting up a very high-end game. And Thielen is still averaging 77 yards per game. He's the wide receiver 24 in the last 4 games and averages 12.4 points with only 1 touchdown. The floor is very reliable for Adam Thielen. So while he wasn't the safe play I expected last week, Coker was better. Thielen's still a decent option, still a reliable flex play at the worst, and I would start him in this tier. I expect double-digit fantasy points from Adam Thielen this week. And then last player in this tier, the ceiling is just too high with Jameson Williams. At Chicago, I mentioned earlier that Amon-Ra St. Brown only has 1 touchdown in 7 career games against the Bears. So I do think Jared Goff is going to have to really throw it a lot this week, and he'll have to rely on other players in the red zone. If Laporta and Jahmyr Gibbs don't steal everything, I could easily see a touchdown available for Jameson Williams. That's what happened last week. It bailed him out. He was having a rough game, but still finished with over 11 points, thanks to a touchdown in garbage time. So JMO, I think, will still have value. I think as a top 30 play, I would be starting him expecting double digits. I think that's a safe floor. He's averaging 9.5 points per game lately, and with only 1 touchdown, he's not as touchdown dependent as you might think. So a safe flex play at number 28, the last player in this tier. I project double-digit fantasy points from everyone above the green line. But beyond the green line, I think we're entering the flex territory, and it's a bit more risky. Maybe it works out, but you kind of need a touchdown to probably reliably go over 10 fantasy points. But Drake London is still really valuable, I think. With Michael Penix, it's not like he's a terrible quarterback, and he'll probably lock onto one player a bit more than others. So unless that's Kyle Pitts, all of a sudden we all get screwed, I would trust London as the only reliable pass catcher in Atlanta this week. I think it's a big game for Tyler Algier and Bijan Robinson. I think they will prevent the rookie quarterback from costing them the win, and maybe he won't throw it as often as Cousins was. But if anything, you're going to get more deep shots from Michael Penix. Cousins was not very effective. I think he really lost a lot of velocity due to the Achilles injury. So maybe Cousins will be never the same. Maybe he's a lot better next year, a year removed from the Achilles. But at the moment, I do see a higher ceiling available for London. But given we've never seen it, the risk factor is not something to overlook, and that's why I only rank him at 29. He's below the tier break and is definitely a lower-end flex option. Not the safest bet, but definitely interesting. Definitely a potential week winner. Wouldn't be shocked if he went over 100 yards and a touchdown if Penix really locks on to Drake London. But then at 30, DeVonta Smith had a massive game last week, over 100 yards and a touchdown, and I could envision that happening again. We all know that DeVonta's really talented. It's just a question of, will this offense decide to favor the run or the pass any given week? In general, they're more of a run-first team, and wouldn't shock me at all if it pivoted back in that direction. But after the success of last week, maybe they keep a more balanced approach against the Commanders. I think they will need to at least get him involved. I could see Marshawn Lattimore giving A.J. Brown some problems on some plays. A.J. Brown could really be locked up a lot by Lattimore. So DeVonta should step up, but has been a bit unreliable in general this season. There is the risk factor he falls back down to what we were getting before last week. So he was terrible. I ranked him way lower than this last week, and I was wrong. And it's just because he had really lost a lot of trust. I still don't have like the most amount of faith in this passing game in Philly, but odds are he's talented enough to trust. At number 30, I definitely can argue I should rank him even higher and at worst be starting Smith in my lineup. But at 31, we got Garrett Wilson versus the Rams. And last week he did find the end zone, but still not a lot of volume for him. And without the touchdown, Garrett Wilson would have probably burned you in fantasy. So not the safest bet. I think Rodgers really prefers to throw it to Adams right now. But obviously it could turn into a massive shootout against the Rams. They will need to throw it to keep up. So he's a decent option. I think it could work out again. And in general, he's averaging about 8.5 targets per game, but only 57 yards, 1 touchdown. Wilson is the wide receiver 39 the last month, and that's definitely not what you expected when you drafted him. So a bit of a liability, but last week was encouraging. I do have Garrett Wilson as a decent flex option, but maybe in a shallower format, you're going to bench him because you have better depth. At 32, I got Zay Flowers versus Pittsburgh, who's been in a major slump lately. Only 1 touchdown, but only 49 yards per game. That's the main reason why he's only wide receiver 47 the last 4 weeks. So not the highest ceiling for Flowers, not many touchdowns, but against the Steelers, they will need him to contribute, and I could envision a scenario where he bounces back. Without the touchdown, he won't go over 10, but if it does hit, you probably get at least 13 points, and Flowers is still a very interesting flex play. We all know he's talented. If he does put up a massive performance, you wouldn't be that surprised to see it from Flowers. At 33, we have Jaylen Waddle versus the Niners, who's questionable this week, did not practice on Wednesday, and I'm kind of convinced he doesn't suit up at all against the Niners on Sunday. But I think if he does play, he's also in this flex territory, just like Garrett Wilson, Zay Flowers, and DeVonta Smith. You're getting like a high ceiling, low floor option, and maybe it doesn't work out, but it's probably worth betting on if you're kind of desperate outside the top 30. Hard to find a better ceiling than a guy like Waddle. But with his injury, it's always a red flag, and maybe you'd rather just avoid it. I would understand removing Waddle from the rankings entirely just to prevent that risk of re-injury. Even if he plays, he might not finish it for the second week in a row. Number 34 is a really interesting pickup off the wire. You're probably not going to trust him, but I actually think Jalen Coker is a viable starter if you need him. An average of 11.3 points per game on only 4.8 targets, 3.3 catches, but 66 yards per game and 2 touchdowns in that sample size. Coker is right behind Thielen as wide receiver 28 in points per game the last 4 months. That's right behind Waddle as well. So Coker ranked here is not a crazy thing to do. The stats do back it up. And while maybe it's a weird name to trust, there's always like random players that do perform well late in the season. They have all the incentive to fight for their next contract and showcase their skills to other teams that are watching. So Coker's vying for a roster spot. I think given the age of Adam Thielen, they might start to pivot as him being their number one option. Last week he was, and it wouldn't shock me if it happened again. I think just like Thielen, Jalen Coker is very, very interesting. While I do have him ranked a tier below, I could easily see him as the better option. In Carolina, I don't think it's a bad decision at all. And then another kind of strange player to rank here, but definitely a high ceiling available, is Tim Patrick at Chicago. In the last 4 weeks, he does have 3 touchdowns and an average of 10.9 points, is a top 30 receiver in that stretch. Only 5.5 targets, 4 catches, and 44 yards, but with no David Montgomery, they're going to throw it even more. And usually Jalen Johnson and the Bears do lock up St. Brown a little bit in this spot. So Patrick could pay off again. He scored a touchdown last week and wouldn't shock me at all. Just like Jalen Coker, picking up guys off the waiver wire at this stage in the game. Maybe you're not going to start them, but at least keep them away from your opponent. I do like Coker and Tim Patrick. In terms of ceiling, I think they're very interesting, viable options this week in your fantasy lineup. But then 36, also in the same range as Jalen McMillan at Dallas, and he's starting to take on a Chris Godwin type of role. The volume is not the same, only 4.5 targets for McMillan, but in terms of production, very valuable in fantasy. 3 touchdowns the last 4 games and only on 43 yards, 3 catches per game, but still very productive, very valuable in fantasy, and touchdowns really cover up a lot of flaws elsewhere. So I think they're going to continue. I think Baker's going to keep torching his opponents. The Cowboys are a top 10 matchup here, and I don't really see them stopping him. At some point, they're going to have to put enough attention on Evans, where they probably forget about McMillan down the field a few times. So I do see Baker taking advantage. I do see when McMillan is targeted that down the field they hit, and they could turn into like a 50-yard house call. Wouldn't shock me at all if McMillan scored another touchdown. So I would at least pick him up. I think he does have a lot of value. I think beyond this point, I don't think anyone else really has a higher ceiling than a guy like McMillan, Tim Patrick, or Coker. They could all go over 18 fantasy points. You wouldn't be shocked at all if it happened. But then at 37, 38, the last two players in this tier would be Xavier Worthy, DeAndre Hopkins versus the Texans. And I view both Chiefs receivers pretty identically. This is a weird offense. We don't even know if Mahomes will play this week. So that's why they're behind guys like McMillan, Patrick, and Coker. Like, I wanted to rank them higher, but if Wentz is the quarterback, I'd probably put the tier break above them. I don't know what I'm getting from the Chiefs receivers with Wentz. But even with Mahomes, it's going to be a weird game. The Texans secondary really shut down the Dolphins last week. And maybe the weather's a factor in Arrowhead as well. It's going to be a very cold game in Kansas City. So Worthy has been a more reliable option for yards, but Hopkins does have one more touchdown than him the last month. And they're both hovering around 9.5, 10 points per game. They're both kind of the same, both getting 7.5 targets. I view both players equally valuable in fantasy right now. But then after Hopkins, I do think there's a tier break, and I would be benching all these players. While there is some interesting name value with all of them, there is a path for success. I just think we haven't seen enough steady production to really trust as locks in your lineup. At 39, I got Marvin Harrison Jr. at Carolina, only averaging 8 points per game the last month. That's the wide receiver 51 on average, and only one touchdown is the main reason why. We know that Harrison hasn't been like elite from a yard standpoint this season, but when he was productive, it's because touchdowns were hitting, and now they're starting to evaporate. I don't trust Harrison at all. The Panthers do have a very good corner, J.C. Horn, that could shut him down on the road. I'd rather avoid Marvin Harrison Jr. I think he's a bit too risky to trust. But then DK Metcalf has been playing like shit lately. The wide receiver 62 in the last 4 games, an average of only 6.9 points per game, is terrible. So no touchdowns is the main reason why. He does average over 50 yards per game, but there's no upside. And if Geno Smith is hurt too much to play, then Metcalf is not reliable at all. I would not start him if Sam Howell got the start for the Seahawks. But this matchup is definitely a big upgrade. I'm definitely compelled to rank him higher, but he's just been so brutal lately. I think just like Deebo Samuel last week, ranking him as a must start is a bad decision. So I'd be fading Metcalf. I don't trust him enough, but the Vikings do give up over 200 yards per game to the position. There is a world where Metcalf does bounce back. This is the matchup to chase after. But number 41, 42, and 43, all back-to-back, I have Romeo Doubs, Jayden Reed, and Christian Watson, the 3 Packers receivers at home versus the Saints on Monday night. The temperature is going to be very low, about 20 degrees in Green Bay on that game, and it could really impact the game plan. I expect Josh Jacobs to get a shit ton of rush attempts, and Love probably doesn't throw it like crazy. If it's snowing, then it would be even worse, but I still think there is some upside. It's not like the Saints are a bad matchup. They rank top 5 against the position. They give up 33.7 points on 14.4 catches, 192 yards per game to the position, along with 6 wide receiver touchdowns. Last week we saw Romeo Doubs score 2 touchdowns, and then a couple weeks ago, before he was putting up a bagel, Jayden Reed had 2 touchdowns himself, but Christian Watson has been the more reliable floor play. Watson's averaging 60 yards per game. Meanwhile, Doubs and Jayden Reed only averaging 34 yards per game. So from a floor standpoint, Watson is actually the safer option, but with no touchdowns in well over a month for Watson, the ceiling is a bit more interesting with Doubs and Jayden Reed. So you're really gambling, playing Russian roulette with any of them. I think in DFS, maybe take a shot on it just for the sake of being a contrarian and having a unique roster. But in season long, I have no idea where the targets are going here. If anything, I only trust Josh Jacobs and Tucker Kraft in that Packers offense. I would not be starting Doubs, Jayden Reed, or Watson. I have no idea which one is the right bet and who will burn you. Odds are 2 of them will burn you, and the one that is good is not the one you'll bet on. But number 44, I got Calvin Ridley at the Colts, and Ridley may get an upgrade in terms of volume because Westbrook-Ikhine is banged up, questionable, may not play in that matchup. And with Mason Rudolph, you kind of trust the target production a bit more. It should be more accurate passes going towards Ridley this week. But the matchup against the Colts is shockingly bottom 2. They've been really stout against receivers lately, only 128 yards per game allowed, and only 1 touchdown to receivers the last 5 games. Ridley has a very low ceiling in this matchup. So I would definitely bench him. He's outside the top 40 the last 4 games as well. And unless he gets a touchdown, you're not going to go over 10 points at all with Calvin Ridley. So definitely bench him. I don't trust him with Rudolph at the Colts. But in the same game, I have Michael Pittman and Josh Downs versus Tennessee. And Pittman is questionable, but I expect him to play. We'll see it with the practice reps indicate on Pittman, but they're not that safe with Richardson. It's just a very random house call that offers high upside, but otherwise the floor is pretty much non-existent. We saw that happen with Downs last week. So Pittman has been getting more targets lately. He's actually been a bit more reliable, the wide receiver 45 in points per game, and I do rank him here at 45, but I kind of feel like Downs is kind of due to have more targets than him. I kind of actually trust Downs a little bit more in general, but lately Pittman has been more productive, so that's why I rank him higher. In this tier, though, I don't want to start any of them. Despite the name value and talent that you expected entering the year, I just don't trust any of their offenses enough to really get them involved and a safe floor available in fantasy. So gonna bench both Colts receivers this week. I don't trust Pittman or Downs enough in my lineup, but then the next few players are a tier below. We have a lot more risk, and I think at this point we're just shooting for the fence, hoping for upside, and a house call is probably the only thing that bails you out if you start these players. But Keon Coleman is very heavily targeted down the field. Last week he only had 1 reception, but it was worth 64 yards, and it could turn into a house call as well. So maybe you'll bet on it. He's actually the wide receiver 37, averaging 9.9 points per game his last 4, an average of 70 yards per game. Keon is not terrible in fantasy at the moment, but 48, we got Darnell Mooney versus the Giants, and with Michael Penix, maybe it works out, but I want to see it definitely before I trust it. The only one I'd be interested in starting this week in Atlanta at receiver would be London. I'm definitely going to pass on Mooney and Ray McCloud. But 49, Tank Dell has been absolutely terrible this season, not safe at all. The wide receiver 69 in the last 4 games, and if he doesn't find the end zone, he will be absolute dog shit. So no thank you on Tank Dell, and no thank you whatsoever on Deebo Samuel. I fell for it last week. I expected the volume to be there. It was, and Deebo did jack fucking shit with those targets and rush attempts. He dropped that potential game-winning touchdown. Maybe he would have been tackled at like the 4 or 5, but still, that dropped pass did cost them the game. That's for sure. Outside the top 50, though, I'm not starting any of these players, but in the same tier as these last 4 I just mentioned, I do have Kendrick Bourne, MVS, Quentin Johnston, Rome Odunze, and Amari Cooper. There's a world where they do work out. I wouldn't be completely shocked at all if you told me Kendrick Bourne or any of these players had a touchdown and went over double-digit points. It's all possible with them. Some of them are wide receiver 1s in their offense, like Kendrick Bourne and MVS are the top receivers in New England and New Orleans, but they're way too risky to bet on. I'm not going to start them at all, and the production has just been way too unreliable lately to endorse. I'm not going to start any of those players in my lineup. But then outside the top 55, all 5 of these guys do have like major dart throw appeal. I think in DFS, they're very compelling. We got Cedric Tillman at Cincinnati, who was very, very productive before going down with the concussion, but with no Jameis Winston, I'd probably bet against it. It could work out, but he's questionable. He might miss another game with that concussion. I would pass on Tillman. I'm also probably going to pass on Bateman. He had 2 touchdowns last week, but without it, you probably get burned. And he's also questionable. I'd probably ignore him in my lineup, but the ceiling is possible to work out. And then Westbrook Akine, also possible to find the end zone, but those have been going away from him lately. I wouldn't trust him with Mason Rudolph. He's questionable as well. Did not practice on Wednesday. And then Alan Lazard, maybe Rodgers does send him a goal line target again. And then at number 60, I do rank Malik Washington versus the Niners here because I don't know what's going to happen with Waddle. I have a feeling Waddle won't play on Sunday. So Malik Washington did step up for him last week. They cut Odell Beckham Jr., and Malik Washington is probably going to be the 4th receiving option behind Jonnu Smith, Davante, and Tyreek Hill if Waddle can't go. So did want to mention him, but at the bottom of these rankings, I wouldn't start him. And then the last player that might be a starting receiver would be Calvin Austin, an honorable mention at wide receiver 61. So those are my top 60 receiver rankings at the position this week. I feel very confident in the top 8. I think those are all locks in your lineup, but the top 18, I also think have all earned your trust as well. I think maybe McLaurin versus the Eagles and McConkey versus Patrick Surtain is kind of scary, but still the top 18 I think are all must starts. Every player above the blue line is averaging at least 14 fantasy points per game. In the last month, I would trust them all in my lineup. But beyond the blue line, it's a little bit more touchdown dependent, but still the ceiling is there. I think they're all worth starting. Reliable flex plays, all inside the top 28, all the way down to Jameson Williams, I think are worth starting. Starting with Drake London, though, we enter the clear flex territory, and that point is a lot more touchdown dependent. They're all coming with some risk. You can't pretend they don't. At that point, London with a new quarterback, Smith could fall off. Wilson hasn't been the same, neither is Flowers. Waddle's banged up. Coker's a random name that we haven't learned to trust yet. Tim Patrick and Jalen McMillan also untrustworthy, but high upside. And then Xavier Worthy, DeAndre Hopkins in the Chiefs offense, you never really know exactly what's going to happen over there. But that's the cutoff point. Beyond Hopkins, I think I'd be benching everyone. But obviously there is a compelling argument with even guys like Marvin Harrison, DK Metcalf, any of the Packers receivers, Ridley, or the Colts receivers. You never know what will happen. But outside that point, I think it's all players that only have DFS value. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Those are my wide receiver rankings. And if you enjoyed, hit that like button for me. And I'll see you next time. My name's Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching Nice and Blunt.